I hope you guys hear me. Oh yeah. Okay, my name is Wojciech, and today I'm going to talk about building your own GraphQL. So imagine that you like to have GraphQL, but you just want to build your own specification for some reason. It's a fun talk, it's engaging, sometimes surprising. I hope you enjoy it. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm a team lead of the developer experience team at Red Hat Cloud. There we build APIs, not GraphQL ones, but I also work with the customers. I'm kind of working with the customers engagement team and doing lots of work about API onboarding, GraphQL, etc. So first of all, before we jump into the talk, I'm going to tell you the typical developer story when I work with those corporate customers, right? So first we have some user that just basically see some issues with their mobile application. They want to introduce GraphQL because the application has some invalid data, it's unreliable, and so on. And as usually, you have some security guy, someone at the company telling you cannot do GraphQL. It involves too much, it's just taking so much time. So what options you have, right? If you can do GraphQL, what else you could do? And there are a gazillion of options. Like over the last 2 years, I've been talking about different conferences about like generating the backend. You can do GraphQL client-side queries. So you can just do GraphQL only on the client and still do RESTful calls. You can do GraphQL proxy. You can use Hashura. Many, many different options, right? I tried them and we went to production with some of them. But then I started thinking, okay, you can use and force yourself to use a GraphQL API, but can you sometimes actually use functionalities of the GraphQL, those best functionalities that you can get from GraphQL with your current system? So first, I started, reaching out to my contacts. I want to say that I contacted every big company in the planet. Actually, I just got a very little response from that. But from what I got, I just got one response for this one basic question. What features of the GraphQL do you really need for your project to not fail? And there's this trick in this question, because it's like if you ask someone what you like in GraphQL, he will tell you like what's being repeated on a conference. But here I really want to know what really brings you to GraphQL. So what's really helps you to adopt to GraphQL and be successful. And number one answer wasn't the thing that I actually got on the conferences. It was, everyone wanted to have SDK, want to have control, what kind of data and typings they have, and that should be generated. Like, I was very surprised because I was thinking like, everyone talking about documentation, overfetching. No, everyone wanted to have SDK for the language. So let's talk about those GraphQL functionalities and like things that typical persona doesn't realize how brilliant GraphQL is, right? So there's this simple thing. Okay, something. Oh yeah. So the slides were out of date. So first, in GraphQL, we have two objects. We have schema, which represents the backend. So this is what we implement on the backend. Schema just represents our data, and it's being later on matched by something called queries. And queries come from the user. So you have a user A has a different query for this specific object, and user B has different object. This is beauty of GraphQL, because you can have another app. You don't need to have separate backend for frontend. You can have one API that everyone calls with for the needs and can generate their code. Okay. So, sorry, my slides literally got out of. Yeah, okay, so then what you're getting is that you're actually generating those different clients in TypeScript and Go. So this second user will have their Go client representing the query, and then the first user will have like TypeScript client representing the different query. So they got the very personalized SDKs for each. So how we can do that without GraphQL? We can use OpenAPI, right? And you probably, wow, Jesus, this old thing, like this guy's talked about, right? It's like every time I bring the Open API, it's like, okay, it was like we go back to 2012 or something. No, it's actually, I want to do the different take on Open API today, because there is a more modern way, more GraphQL focused way that you can work with Open API. So when you're generating clients with Open API, by definition, at the beginning, you're being slammed by a number of issues. First of all, you're going to have very large models because you don't have a choice. Literally in GraphQL, you're choosing the queries and you're getting what you want. Here, you're just basically getting entire SDK being in front of you. So your backend has 10 years of development. You're getting 10 years of development in the code in front of you. You have no guarantee that your API will work because Open API is being put as a, basically it's being written by people or generated from the backend, which also can be incorrect. So naming can be ugly. It's a different choice, right? And generators, most of the generators have some issues and bugs. So eventually, if we compare them, we can have that feeling like, okay, there's nothing to compare. GraphQL beats OpenAPI by tooling, but we can a little bit tweak it up. Even if we have some old standard that have been there for a while, we can always evaluate on it. So how we can apply this GraphQL features to OpenAPI? So there are a number of generators out there. The Microsoft done one. The most popular one, it's based on Swagger. The very version of this OpenAPI was called Swagger. So the project was called OpenAPI Generator. And let's just cover how this OpenAPI generator works. So you're starting with this OpenAPI file. So usually your team will need to either generate it from the backend, write it manually, and then this generator will have this model that's being driven from OpenAPI file. Then we have a templates, and later on we're getting this large TypeScript, JavaScript, every language you want, SDK. And basically when we think about this ecosystem in OpenAPI generator, if you have used that 6 years ago and use it today, you may think, oh, 6 years ago, maybe it's a little bit better. No, it's not. It's the same. So it's the tooling in a GraphQL evolves very fast. With OpenAPI, tooling is mature, is good, but it doesn't evolve that much. So for GraphQL, we usually use some toolings that gives us everything. For OpenAPIs, we need to apply this Unix approach. So we need to use the specific tools for the job and use those granular tools for specific tasks. So let's talk how we can extend OpenAPI to make it at least look like GraphQL. So first of all, we need to have ability to merge these OpenAPI files. Because imagine that you have multiple backends, right? And each of these backends is being exposed to a great gateway and interacting with that gateway. You really want to know what will be your overall API, not those just microservices on its own. It's very important to validate. Remember, OpenAPI itself can be written by person, so we need to have a way to check if you meet the standards, if the OpenAPI is valid. And another problem when we building the code generator is that even small changes in the code generation can drive number of changes. So we need to have a way to minimize those changes only for things that we really want. So for that, we can use this pattern called filter and transform. So every change in the model, we filter and transform the same way that GraphQL does. So you have entire schema, but you don't get 7,000 queries. You actually need to write the queries yourself. So here is the same. We can actually do filtering and transforming of this OpenAPI object to the queries that we really want. And then lastly, if you want to have some extra capabilities, you can also customize the templates. So OpenAPI generator comes with the templates that are driving the languages, so they are used to generate those SDKs in a specific language. So that's there. So if we apply all of that, in theory, we should be able to actually avoid all those issues. All they're gone, and we have our own GraphQL without even using GraphQL. That's a theory. I want to show you the tools that you can use to try it out. So let's pick some tools to build this. So first, for filter and transform, on the very left, we have a GraphQL, and GraphQL comes with a schema. So remember this GraphQL schema, it's something that represents your data model and usually represents all the capabilities you have on the backend. And then you have a GraphQL document. This is what your individual teams working on UI and so on, and they're writing by hand because that's the data queries they have. And those data queries usually are being used, transformed by OpenAPI generator, Apollo generator, to actual TypeScript, TypeScript, Go, any language you use on a client to call this API. In OpenAPI, we don't have that abstraction. So we need to invent something. We need to bring this concept into OpenAPI file, because OpenAPI file itself represents entire state on the backend. So we need to have a subset of the OpenAPI just for our needs. And there are many different toolings out there. So if you like, I don't want to do self-promotion, but if you do like OpenAPI filter, OpenAPI transform, but I just want to show you the concept, right? So the concept is that you need to build additional metadata file, right? That contains like this get users, it's just operation that is being represented in your OpenAPI file. And then you can pick the right fields from it. And what will be result, it just takes the OpenAPI file from your backend and creates your own OpenAPI file that you can use to generate the code. And then what you're getting, it's not the entire backend, it's only the methods and only the specification for specific things that you need. Merge, there's an existing project called OpenAPI Merge. You can just run it in your CI/CD, run it in pipeline, merge multiple microservices into one OpenAPI and have your gateway. It can merge your security requirements, you can make sure endpoints and things like that. Validation. The problem with OpenAPI is that it's basically generic. It was designed to describe every possible API on the planet. So you can even describe GraphQL API. If you're brave enough, GraphQL API can be described using OpenAPI. And the problem is that there's some very weak spots of the OpenAPI. I've been working with this for like the last 7 years. Every time I see all of or one of, I smell some issues. Because there's very hard, as a tooling engineer, building the support for those is very hard. Because there's multiple ways to reference the inheritance in the models. So if you have some inheritance on the backend, so something inherits from each other, it's very hard to reflect that then on the client side. The same way with the input types. GraphQL solved the problem because they have this new type in the schema called input type. In OpenAPI, you don't have that, so you need to basically have some validation to prevent users from not doing it. And I'm using another promotion. It's actually, I'm not affiliated, but Spectral, it's actually doing, Spectral comes from Stoplight company. It's open source, you can use it. And basically what it does, it just gives you validation for your OpenAPI. It can check if your OpenAPI is valid, you have right examples, and you can even write your own rule sets. I use that daily to write some, additional rules for the issues we see. It's very useful. It's very useful when we run it on a PR level. So if someone adds new functionality to the backend, we can run that as well. So we have all our tools in the right place. So we can merge, validate, filter, and transform. And you may ask, like, how about overfetching? So a little bit of overfetching, because like the biggest benefit of GraphQL is that you can query multiple endpoints by just sending one request to the server, right? So you can get entire graph by just one request, right? In that approach, you're still calling the individual REST services, so you can't really like minimize the overfetching problem. However, you will be able to do some micro tweaks. For example, you can ask your backend engineer to introduce 2 headers. For example, if you want to select some fields, I do that successfully every time. Like we do header that selects user ID and name, and then on the backend they have this generic filter. So when we actually getting a result, we can filter results back to the user, so they only get user ID and name, and nothing else is being sent. It's still not, giving us ability to batch the requests and things like that. And I lost, I don't know what happened, but I lost like 6 slides, so this is, this is it. Thank you so much for watching.
Thanks for the presentation. Very nice stuff. Do we have any questions? Don't be shy. Yes, we have one, but we need to use the microphone because we are streaming, so.
Yes, seems like you have experience writing like clients for OpenAPI. What would be your suggestion, like if the API itself is not that big, I don't know, like 20, 30 resources, would it make sense to, like, if you want to have a quality client, would it make sense to write your own or like use this generation stuff and like auto-generated clients?
I will still always auto-generate it for a number of reasons. First of all, if you have ability to do the strong contract, it's all about API contract. So how you work with the backend engineers. So even if your API is small right now and you have, let's say, 20 objects, some process of negotiation, new changes from the product back to UI, back to backend, it's easier when you have a common platform to do it. I cannot imagine UI engineer goes to the backend and just tells on the database like, you know, please change this and this. It's all about having the platform for negotiation. I can spoil a little bit Hashura, because if you use Hashura, you can avoid that because you will be able to use UI thing to have the model. But if you don't use Hashura, you have no way to speak about this common thing. You need to have common language across different teams. For example, UI, backend, sometimes DevOps, a database admin, and OpenAPI and API itself gives you that. As well as, you know, like SDK generation, you may feel like, okay, it will be faster, but evolution of it, if you can actually, if you imagine you have a bug and you need to put it into the backend, you can fix it on the backend within an hour and you can deploy it, but then your clients need to manually know what was changed, then reflect that into SDK, then add it to UI. It takes time. But now, how we solve that in Red Hat Cloud is that every time we have 5 minutes to deploy, right? Because there is huge CV, like error, that, you know, will affect our users. So what happens is that something goes to the backend, it's being tested and released, and we instantly get, once it's being released to QE, we instantly get SDK that being automatically injected in every client. That triggers automatic tests. So we don't even have a developers, right, that need to check it. We just basically see that things are working and like we use the robots for it. So the many different benefits. If you like to write things from scratch and your API doesn't deal with JSON, you have like files, some artificial file types, I think that will be received for disaster if you use OpenAPI generator, because it's mainly focused on JSON. But if you have just basic API, JSON-based API, I think you will be much better if that you can automate it, do some CI/CD, as well have some level of validation as well. It's less like you can just deploy to production in 5 minutes.
Do we have any other questions?
Okay, in this approach, the client is consuming the OpenAPI that is generated from the GraphQL
no, like
schema.
It could be, right? So you can basically have POC in GraphQL and then generate OpenAPI. But this approach actually, it takes the functionalities of the GraphQL and there's no GraphQL execution logic. So most of the time when I work with those enterprises, the challenge is not only to, you know,
emulating the GraphQL using the OpenAPI in general.
So yeah, it's basically like taking some of the most important things from GraphQL and have them in OpenAPI, which is not anything new. Like it's basically all about reducing the OpenAPI specification to whatever size we want, whatever queries we want to execute, and then generating the SDKs.
Okay. Then basically this is like taking the best ideas from the GraphQL and implanting them on the OpenAPI standard, and then introduce the extra tooling to do these things.
Yes, and this is for special persona where someone tried to use GraphQL, but for some reason they cannot really deploy it. Like security guy in the company said that, sorry, you're not going to expose the API that you can call every possible element in a database, right? So those are the challenges we're dealing with those enterprise customers most of the time. And we still want them to use GraphQL, and we use that microservice approach. But then when we do it, we don't want to have some other teams that are not working on this like backend that doesn't have that ability to feel that they are excluded. So we're trying to match all the functionalities on the platform, both GraphQL and OpenAPI, having the same capabilities. So you still can query what you want. You can still pick some resources and have at least similar experience. I can tell you straight away, if I give you the TypeScript code for your UI application, you will not be able to tell to me, like this is React hook generated from OpenAPI. You will never tell me, is that you will not see the difference between OpenAPI and GraphQL. And that's the beauty of it, right? So engine that's being used under the hood is being completely abstracted by the capability. And capability is just being able to generate a client you really want to use. For example, I have situation when the JSON that's being returned for the user could be like 2 megabytes and you need 4 fields. And if we keep in this entire SDK, it will be disaster. It will be lots of code, the UI code will be large, but we can keep that to minimum and everyone's happy, right? Because the developers dealing with the models they really want and they can evolve them. It's also, evolution is very important because you can write these models by your hand and many people choose to do it. But when they do it, the problem is that someone changed something on the back end and then you need to figure it out what was changed. If with OpenAPI, you don't need to do that. You have that tooling that generates it for you, and like TypeScript and stuff.
There is still a problem of distribution where you have this OpenAPI generated. You still need to distribute it to the client.
Yeah, I love that question. I really love that question. I'm a big fanboy of the tool called Renovate, or if you guys know, GitHub has this thing called Dependabot. So what we do is that we have this CI/CD pipelines where every time something changed on OpenAPI, we have the GitHub event. We rebuild every possible SDK we have in 5 different languages in Red Hat Cloud. And then Dependabot deals with this rest of the stuff for ourselves. It just goes there, picks the like NPM modules, Go versions, Python modules, just injects them into clients. I don't even know our clients. Like, could be you, like using Red Hat Cloud, and you're getting automatic updates of our SDK, right? And then it runs the build on your side, checks if SDK is passing the build, and most of the time will pass. Sometimes it will fail, so then you need to have manual action. But if it will pass, it just auto-merges, and you're up to date. It's magic.
So one question from me, and does it support somehow deprecation mechanism that GraphQL has, which is like very nice feature that I like, and it helps us a lot when releasing new versions, which we do like every 2 weeks or every month. There is a major release which breaks something, and with deprecation it really helps to keep clients working.
I love this question, but problem with me is that if I start talking about it, it will be another talk. This is my thing, like with OpenAPI, deprecation by definition, it's not being supported at all in OpenAPI generator. So my team and many different community contributors have been building those custom templates that dealing with the deprecation strategies with OpenAPI. And there's some crazy ideas out there. For example, if you deprecate, maybe the new version of SDK should automatically remove that field so people will get their builds crashing, so they know that this is being removed. But trust me, we're not going to end up in like we can talk about it, or I can prepare a new talk for next session.
Nice. It would be actually nice to hear.
It's a very good talk, right? It's a very good topic, and it's like there's so many different ways you can do that. Sadly, there is not a good way by default provided by, I don't know any generator that actually deals with this right now, but it's possible, and we do it.
Okay. I think we are running out of time, so thank you so much for the talk. Big applause to Wojciech for this presentation.